All right, we're good. This is going to be the final three sections of our discussion on the timeline and the life of Paul and the other apostles. This particular video is going to include Paul's pastoral epistles, the persecution epistles, and then the ending ones in the New Testament and the general epistles, which pretty much are the books of John and the book of Revelation. So I'm gonna pause between each section of the video and put up a graphic so that you can stop at that point in the video if that's all that you need for the moment, and also so I can splice the videos together. But this should basically be able to finish your timeline for the rest of the school year. And so it's going to be take those segments, though you can do them piece by piece, but it's going to end up wrapping up the school year. So if you have your timeline, that's all we're going to need for now. Maps are already finished. So you're really just going to need to have your timeline beginning in the mid-60s going through the year 110, I believe, is when we end the video. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen here and begin with this. We're going to start then in the time period of Nero, the emperor of Rome during this time. He became emperor in 54, so we've already spent quite a bit of time of our timeline in the writing of the Bible, the experience of the New Testament in the time of Nero. In fact, in Paul's imprisonment, the first imprisonment, though it began in Judea, and he spent quite a few years in Caesarea Philippi, being tried by some lesser potentates like King Agrippa and Governor Felix. When Paul appealed to Rome, he actually was appealing to Caesar, who was Nero at this time. We don't really know the verdict of Paul's Paul's appeal to Rome. We don't know what happened. We know that he was under house arrest for a while between 61 and 64. During that time, he wrote Colossians, Philemon, Philippians, and Ephesians. And then he was probably released. And so we're going to start actually with that point, zooming into the timeline now in the mid-60s with Paul being released from jail. And so going from that bigger picture, we're about the mid-60s now. You should already have the beginning of the 60s filled out. And now we're going to start in the middle. But just a reminder as you fill out your timeline, historical events go above the line, books of the Bible go below the line. And that helps keep a clean timeline and helps it be able to be differentiated when you get to the final. And if I ask a question about something in the 60s, that helps you be able to find that real quickly. So begin your timeline on the pastoral epistles in 64 with Paul being released from jail, probably from house arrest. And that's the assumption we're making for this class and for these videos. But he's released from jail. About that time, or maybe even a little before that time, Nero has burned Rome. I believe I mentioned this at the end of the last lecture. A variety of reasons why possibly he burned Rome. A lot of people think that he was wanting to clear some property for a building project that he had. And it's like, okay, we're done with that. Looking for just people to blame, maybe the Christians, maybe the Jews. Definitely know that he blamed the Christians. Here's a picture of one of his parties. And people, you see this in the background here, people being burned at the stake. And so they're basically, they're these candles at one of Nero's party. He was just a vicious, perverted psychopath as he ruled. Rumor has it, and it really is a rumor, that Nero fiddled while Rome was burning. He's actually playing a lyre in this picture, which is more like a handheld harp. But he did not play the fiddle, because the fiddle or the violin or any kind of shape of that really wasn't invented for maybe even another 1,000 years from this point in time. And so he wasn't fiddling while Rome burned. And so it's what we would call an anachronism. It's something that doesn't really fit with his time frame. So we pick it back up with our conversation. So really soon after Paul's release, maybe at the end of his term, but probably after his release, Paul begins his travels again. Very probably he's in Macedonia now, visiting possibly Philippi, Thessalonica, and he writes the book of First Timothy. And he sent Timothy to Ephesus, and really this goes to the end of Paul's life as far as we know. He sends Timothy to Ephesus, try to fix some of the problems in the church of Ephesus. Paul loves the church of Ephesus. Remember, he spent 2 years on his second missionary journey in Ephesus. And has such a close relationship that as Paul on his third journey is heading home from Corinth, he calls the elders of the Ephesians out to the coast to meet with them, and he just a very teary goodbye. But he warns them against false teachers, including some of them who might be false teachers. He says, "Be careful; they're gonna rise," and they do, and that tears the church apart. It's a pretty mature church. We can tell that by the levels of leadership they have. They have elders and deacons, and only the more mature churches had those. And so Paul sends Timothy, then his son in the faith, to um, Ephesus to take care of that. And then he sends this letter after Timothy, which is basically a list of instructions and things that he's supposed to do. Similarly, about this time, Paul writes a letter to Titus. Now, it's a personal letter to Timothy with instructions, and a personal letter to Titus also with instructions. Very similar. They both talk about establishing elders. Timothy is reestablishing elders in Ephesus. Titus is establishing elders for the first time in the churches of Crete. And so around 64, 65, he writes this letter. Now, here is the city of Ephesus. Paul is probably up here in Macedonia, in Philippi or Thessalonica. Sends Timothy to Ephesus. There's Colossae, by the way. We just discussed that earlier. And then here's the island of Crete. And those are the places that Paul is sending out two of his sons in the faith and to establish or reestablish churches as we go. So in the same year, then we go down the timeline just a little bit. We have Luke writing the Acts of the Apostles. Luke spends a lot of time with Paul as he goes through really the second half of Acts. You see the narrative change in Acts chapter 16 from reporting in the third person to reporting in the first person, saying they did this. He says we did this. So Paul writes the Acts of the Apostles, which takes us really up to Paul's imprisonment in about 61-ish, and now Luke is finally writing that. And there is a lot of people that would say the Acts ends open-ended, and that our job is to finish that. We've been working on that for about 19 and a half centuries, working at finishing Acts of the Apostles. Paul then Peter also about this time, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. Now, Peter writes his first epistle. We believe that over here that Peter speaks through Mark as he writes. Mark writes his gospel, probably the accounts of Peter, but Peter writes his own epistle, First Peter, to a group of churches, probably in northern Asia Minor, and the lecture gives you a little bit more details. But he's writing this in the mid-60s, just like Paul, who is writing in the mid-60s, 64, 65, to some churches that Peter writes to churches that he loves very dearly. And so Peter writes probably from Rome. We get to the year 65, and we really begin a season of persecution. And so I'm going to pause here just for a second because we've concluded our discussion on the pastoral epistles. If that's something that you specifically missed, really that year 64, 65, we have Paul writing First Timothy and Titus, and Peter writing First Peter. About this time, Luke also writes the Acts of the Apostles, and that really is just that brief season. I included Philemon in this, so Philemon was written probably more in 61 because it's a very personal letter. You could also include Second Timothy. It's a pastoral or personal letter, and even Second Peter. But I'm going to include those more in the persecution epistles. They're going to come here in a year or two, and you'll see why, and I'll explain a little bit of why. So we're going to pause here for a second. So we're done talking about the introduction to the pastoral epistles, and now we're going to move into the persecution epistles. So now we're going to begin the persecution epistles. There's really a blend between the pastoral and the persecution epistles because they're written mostly by Peter and Paul, but they're very personal, and that's why we call them pastoral. But they also begin an era of persecution of the church. And though Paul has written a lot in his epistles about coming persecution, even his own persecution, there is a general atmosphere of persecution and literal persecution coming down, a lot of it then from Nero. And we're going to see the end of Peter and Paul actually coming down from Nero or under his administration. We're going to start in the year 65 here on our timeline, and that we're going to actually begin with the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews, we know a lot about the book, and we can put some timing in the book. It's a pivotal book in understanding the way that the New and the Old Testaments tie together. Hebrews and Matthew actually are very pivotal in that. Hebrews doesn't actually talk a lot about Roman persecution. Hebrews actually refers to a lot of Jewish persecution. Now we're at the end of the 60s, approaching the year 70 AD, and we know that the Jewish temple, which is pictured here, is completely destroyed in the year 70 AD. As that year approaches, a lot of there's an increasing amount of antagonism between the Jews and the Romans. Part of that then overflows to the Jewish Christians, where the Jews are trying to purify who they are, and they're beginning to see the Christians as outsiders, and they want just Jews involved. So there's an increased intensity in the persecution from the Jewish leaders towards Jewish Christians. We've already seen that they've killed James, the brother of Jesus, by throwing him off the top of this here temple. You can see then, get a better idea of why that's a big feat and a disastrous thing. But the author of Hebrews, and we don't know who the author is, and I'll go more into that with the lecture, but the author of the Hebrews is saying to the Jews, or to the Hebrews, don't turn back to Judaism. The persecution is intense again, but don't go back to Judaism. And here's why. Because Christianity is the fulfillment of all the Jewish law and the prophets. And he goes into great detail, and the chapter you're going to read in that really explains that. So that's probably written around 65, though we don't really know who the author is. We know the audience is Jews, probably Jews in the Holy Land, and it was probably written well before the destruction of Jerusalem, because that's not mentioned, and it refers to the temple in the present. There's an assumption then that the temple's still standing. We get to the year 67, and a couple of things happen in 67. We're actually going to start below the line, and you'll see why we have to start down there. Peter writes his second epistle. It's very clear in Peter's second epistle that he is near death. It's kind of like a last will and testament, a last words to some people that he dearly loves, probably churches in northern Asia. We don't know much about Peter's travels. We know that he ends up in Rome, and he's in Rome as he writes. But he very possibly went through that northern area of Asia, of modern-day Turkey, that Paul was actually forbidden in Acts 16 from going to. Peter writes to them very specifically. Let me make a couple comments here about this picture, which just moved very quickly away from me. So this picture, there's a couple of things to be noted. In the picture of Peter, this is near the end. He looks older than the other picture, but there are two keys, and these are known to church, particularly Catholic Church, but to church historians as the keys of Peter. The keys of Peter, and one of the signs of Peter are these two keys. And it goes back to the passage where Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "You're right. And God revealed that to you, Peter. And upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And you'll be given the keys to the kingdom." Most Protestants and even Eastern Orthodox believers, so that's 2/3 of Christianity, believe that is the idea that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. The Catholics say, yes, he is, but really the rock that we're talking about is Peter, because Peter means rock. Jesus changed Peter's name from Cephas or Simon, which means to Peter, which means rock. And so that rock is actually Peter. So therefore the church is built on Peter, and Peter is given the keys to the kingdom. And so that's the symbol of the papacy in Rome. And the Pope will have a fisherman's ring. And in some pictures of Peter, you see him with that ring on, and the keys to the kingdom. And that's the symbol of Peter, and therefore the symbol of the Pope in Rome. So St. Francis, the current Pope in Rome, would have those symbols associated with him. But anyhow, we're not talking about that. We're talking about Peter writing his second and last epistle to those churches that he loves dearly. It's interesting to note that in his last epistle, he also refers to very specifically to the authoring of Scripture. And in fact, of the two New Testament passages that we have about the inspiration of Scripture, 2 Peter has one of the clearest ones, and so does 2 Timothy, which is going to come up next. Peter also mentions in 2 Peter the Apostle Paul and how he writes things that are hard to understand, putting Paul then with in the canon of Scripture. Jude then also writes. Now, Jude is this other brother of Jesus. We don't hear a lot about him except for in this book. His name is Jude or Judah, and he refers to himself as James's brother, but not so by association and by tradition, he's Jesus's brother. Jude writes the second to the last book in our Bibles, and it's like Second Peter. It's kind of a meandering book, but it mentions a lot about the last days, false prophets, and persecution. It's actually a really excellent book. It was very, I would say, it's kind of a little bit postmodernist narrative in that it just weaves around, and it's not real linear like you would find with Paul's book of Romans. And then finally, we have Paul writing his second letter to Timothy. It's a follow-up letter to Timothy in his ministry in Ephesus. Timothy is still there, and we understand that Timothy actually probably ends up in the church in Ephesus, possibly even to his death, and ends up playing a pretty significant role, as does the Apostle John. But one of the unique things, couple unique things about this letter that we'll talk about in the lectures, it's very much, very clearly that Paul believes he's going to die. And sometime in this point in time, Paul is rearrested. This time he's under house arrest. This time he's kept in what's called the Mamertine prison, which is an underground prison. They let you down into a hole in the cave in the ground, and if you're lucky enough to have relatives or friends that bring you food, they give you food that way. Otherwise, you end up starving to death or freezing to death or dying from one of the diseases you get. Paul, and possibly even Peter are in this prison. And he's writing from this prison then to Timothy, giving him some instructions. He's cold. He asks for his coat. He asks for his books or his scrolls that he's writing, and asks Timothy to come see him as soon as he can. Very clearly his last writing. Also, like with Second Peter, Second Timothy also includes a lot of references to the end time, or the end, to persecution, to false prophets, but also to the inspiration of Scripture. In 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, like 2 Peter 1:21, those are two of the biggest passages on the inspiration of Scripture that we have in the New Testament. Right after Peter and Paul write these two last letters of them, then they are killed by Nero's people. I'll just put it that way. Peter is crucified upside down. Peter is not a Roman citizen, and so he's crucified along with his wife. And we don't know really much about the rest of the apostles and if they even had spouses, but from the Gospels we know that Peter is married. Was crucified with his wife, and there's a record that somebody, or the legends that come down to us that are now written, where they're encouraging each other. She is encouraging him, he is encouraging her as they are killed together. But Peter says, please don't crucify me like my Lord. And so they crucified him upside down, which probably led to a more miserable, quicker death, because he didn't want to be crucified like Jesus was. Remember, his brother Andrew is also crucified, but on an X, which becomes a symbol of the cross of St. Andrew. So there's a picture of him being crucified upside down. He's an old man by this time. He was the oldest of the 12, and he's old in this point as well. Tradition tells us his bones, possibly even Paul's bones, but definitely Peter's, are underneath the altar of St. Peter's Basilica there in Rome. And it's hard to know whether that's true or not. There are bones down there. Paul, around the same time, is also killed, but he's beheaded, because Paul, and we've learned this from his our previous discussions, Paul is a citizen of Rome. Really interesting discussion about Paul and his rights in Acts 16, in 1 Corinthians 9 as well. This is why in Acts 26 and 27 he appeals to Rome, all because he's a citizen. Citizens are not crucified. Citizens are beheaded. It's a more dignified thing. So Paul is beheaded outside the gate of Rome. There's a traditional site there. Here's an artist rendition of this, that his head was radiant even after he was killed. Tradition, myth, legend. We don't know what part is true and what part is not. Maybe it was. And so he's killed. And there's a church now at the site in Rome that Paul was killed in. Not long after that, we're getting close now to 69. You see on the edge of the screen, you see 70 starting to show up there, the 070. John Mark, the nephew of Barnabas and the close companion of Paul. John Mark possibly was to Paul what Timothy, or to Peter, I'm sorry, what Timothy was to Paul. Anyhow, he becomes, tradition tells us, the leader of the church in Alexandria, and he's killed around 69 in Alexandria. He was actually at the altar celebrating communion and was dragged outside and drug around the city until by horses until he died. Nero dies not long after that. Amazingly, great men of the faith are killed, and then Nero finally succumbs. He's killed so many people just for the fun of it, so many people out of paranoia, his mother, his wife's, even some of his sons, a lot like Herod the Great. But he dies, and there's a picture of his tomb that is built. And that kind of wraps up this very violent decade of the 60s, and really now the persecution of the church has officially begun from the Roman Empire, not just by locals. So that's the history of the 60s, a history of a lot of that persecution. There are the books of the Bible that were written during the 60s, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. We have Colossians and Philemon and Ephesians and Philippians that were written, the Gospel of Mark, and then the pastoral epistles by the first to Timothy, two of them, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus. Peter writes 1st and 2nd Peter. Jude writes his epistle in here as well. And then also the book of Hebrews is written during this period of time. We're going to move now to the 70s. The early 70s, really not a lot is done as far as the canon of Scripture. According to this guy's research, my research, we have near the beginning of the 70s, we have the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. We have the beginnings of the Colosseum in Rome. So Peter and Paul not involved with the Colosseum in Rome, probably in Ephesus. Paul was sent to the lions but survived. Vespasian, after a struggle of power over on the left, Vespasian becomes the emperor, and that's how we begin this decade. He rules really for most of the 70s. Couple of things that to add to the top of your timeline or to the above the line. Jude, Jesus's half brother, is killed in Edessa, which is probably up towards modern day Armenia. Barnabas is also killed, probably around 73. And then Simon the Zealot, there's a couple places that Simon might have been killed. Fox's Book of Martyrs puts Simon the Zealot, Simon the terrorist, to put it in modern day languages. They put him being killed up actually in Britain. So those of us that are British, English, Irish, Scotch, that's where they're from. And so that's really those are really the notable things in the 70s. We move towards the end of the 70s. The Colosseum is completed by the time we get to 80. We see that, and then very soon after that, Christians have started to be killed in the Colosseum, but not necessarily the apostles that we see in the 80s. We continue with just apostles being killed off. Matthias, the one that they drew lots in Acts chapter 1, Matthias replaced Judas, the Iscariot, the betrayer. He is killed in Jerusalem around 80. Luke is martyred in Greece, probably around 84. Bartholomew, another one of the apostles we don't hear a lot about, is killed around 85-ish in Armenia. But then we also move into some of the books that were written, very possibly in the mid to late 80s or the early 90s. And I'm going to place them because that's where Fox does. I'm going to place them in the 80s. But John writes his Gospels, and he writes the Gospel of John from Ephesus, and where he ends up taking up residence along with Jesus' mother Mary. He writes a very different gospel, and so we don't call it a synoptic like Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar in stories and arrangement and chronology. John's is very different. There's now a heresy called Gnosticism. Was Jesus both God and man? Was he really was just the spirit came on him, but he wasn't fully God and fully man? We call that the hypostatic union. So John writes his gospel saying, here's this man who's fully God to prove that Jesus was God. And we saw that when we studied the gospel. And so it's very a different, it's written in a different way to prove a different point than the other gospels. Also from Ephesus, he writes these little mini epistles. First John is the longest one. talks a lot about love, like he does in the gospel, a lot about false prophets and false apostles. And then he writes shorter letters to individual churches. Very possibly the church at Ephesus had these satellite churches because the church at Ephesus was probably a very large church. And our church, Our Lady, and then a guy named Gaius are two different congregations that Paul was writing to as he wrote second and third John as well from Ephesus, or probably around 86, 87, very possibly clear into the 90s. John continues his ministry then into the 90s, and then near the end of the 90s, tradition tells us that John is captured and boiled alive by the emperor at the time, possibly in the Colosseum. The emperor's law, according to tradition, tells us you can't be killed twice. So he's boiled alive, no effect on him at all. He survives that boiling. God wasn't done with him yet. And so as a result, near the end of his life, near the end of the first century, John is exiled to the island of Patmos. It's on the island of Patmos then, which is out in the Aegean Sea between Greece and Asia Minor or Turkey, that John has his revelation, which is written down in the very last book of the Bible, the book of Revelations. Unfortunately, we can't spend a lot of time in that, but we do have an elective for your senior year called the Apocalyptic Literature, which covers Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation and some of those other prophecy passages. So around 95 to 100, John writes the book of Revelation. Tradition indicates to us that John returns to Ephesus and is buried actually in this location. He dies of natural causes there in Ephesus around the year 100. And so he apparently returns from exile. Some people would put the writing of the epistles after that. Most people would put the writing of the Revelation or the Apocalypse, as some people call it, at the end of his life. And so the lives of the apostles, you could even say the extended version of the Acts of the Apostles, end around the year 100. So what I've done in this video, just in summary, is 64, 65-ish. I talked about the pastoral epistles, starting 65 and really going through 80. We have the persecution epistles, but mostly they're at the end of the 60s, not much in the 70s. And then that would be the persecution epistles. And then we have in the 80s or 90s, then we have the last, what I call last things of last writings, which would be Paul's gospel, or John's gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and then the book of Revelation. And then that really wraps up the canon of Scripture, wraps up the first century of Jesus and the Christian movement, and it wraps up the lives of the last apostles. Remember, John doesn't die a martyr's death, which is predicted that he won't die a martyr, that he won't die or won't be killed for the faith. It's predicted in John 21. He dies of natural causes. The others then are killed a martyr's death. So you should have those things filled in really from the mid 60s to 100 filled in on your timeline. And so if you're homebound and watching this video at home, please take a picture of each of those pages and send them to me. Make sure they're clear so I can read them. If you're at school, I'll check those actually live and in person. Thanks for sticking with me through the explanations and that sort of thing. That is the end of the Acts chronology for the New Testament and the end of this video.